Welcome to our channel, where history comes alive in the most fascinating ways. Today, we're stepping back in time to the bustling, smoky streets of Victorian London. Picture this, a city transformed by revolution, where horses thundered down cobblestone roads, where the first omnibuses carried crowds through narrow lanes, and where the roar of steam trains echoed through the fog. But there's more to this story than just transportation. We're also diving into something darker, something deeply personal to the Victorians. The strange, elaborate culture of mourning that gripped an entire society. So buckle up, because this journey through Victorian London is going to be unlike anything you've imagined. Before we begin, if you love history, mystery, and stories that transport you to another time, make sure to hit that subscribe button and smash the like button right now. It helps us bring you more incredible content like this. And hey, we're curious. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know your location. Are you tuning in from New York, Los Angeles, maybe London itself? We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's set the scene. Victorian London. The 1800s was a city unlike any the world had ever seen. It was the heart of the British Empire, a sprawling metropolis where wealth and poverty existed side by side, where innovation and tradition clashed in the streets. The population exploded during this era, going from about 1 million people in 1800 to over 6 million by 1900. Can you imagine? That kind of growth created chaos, but also opportunity. And at the center of it all was the question that plagued city planners, businessmen, and everyday citizens alike. How do you move millions of people through streets designed for thousands? The answer was horses. Thousands upon thousands of horses. If you walked through Victorian London on any given day, you'd be surrounded by them. Horses pulling carriages for the wealthy. Horses hauling goods for merchants. Horses powering the omnibuses that became the city's first form of public transit. They were everywhere. And I mean everywhere. Estimates suggest that in the 1890s, there were around 300,000 horses working in London alone. Think about that for a moment. 300,000 living, breathing animals, filling the streets with their sounds, their smells, and yes, their waste. The streets of Victorian London were, well, let's just say they weren't pretty. Horse manure piled up faster than it could be cleaned. On a busy day, a single horse could produce up to 30 pounds of manure. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands, and you've got a serious problem. The smell was overwhelming, especially in the summer heat. Flies swarmed everywhere, disease spread easily, and when it rained, the streets turned into rivers of muck and filth. People had to navigate carefully, lifting their long skirts and coats, trying desperately not to slip or soil themselves. It was a messy, grimy reality that defined daily life. But despite the chaos, horses were essential. They were the engines of Victorian London. The wealthy rode in private carriages, elegant vehicles pulled by sleek, well-groomed horses. These carriages were symbols of status, custom-built with plush interiors and polished exteriors. If you were rich, you didn't walk, you rode. And your carriage said everything about who you were. For everyone else, there were the omnibuses. Ah, the omnibus. This was London's first real attempt at mass public transportation. The word omnibus comes from Latin, and that's exactly what it was meant to be: transportation for everyone. The first horse-drawn omnibus appeared in London in 1829. Introduced by a man named George Shillabere. It was a large carriage, pulled by 3 horses. that could carry about 20 passengers. It ran along a fixed route from Paddington to the Bank of England. And for a small fare, ordinary people could hop on and travel across the city. The omnibus was revolutionary. Before this, if you weren't wealthy enough to own a carriage, you walked. Simple as that. But now, clerks, shopkeepers, working-class families, they could all afford to ride. The omnibus became a social space, a place where different classes mingled, where conversations happened, where London's diversity was on full display. Of course, it wasn't always comfortable. The ride was bumpy, the seats were hard, and if the bus was crowded, which it often was, you'd be squeezed in like sardines. But it was progress. It was movement. And Londoners embraced it. By the mid-1800s, omnibuses were everywhere. Different companies competed for passengers, running routes all over the city. The buses were painted in bright colors, each company with its own distinctive look. Some had advertisements plastered on the sides, early versions of what we see today. And the drivers? They were characters in their own right. Known as cabbies or busmen, they navigated the chaotic streets with skill and confidence, shouting at pedestrians, maneuvering around other vehicles, keeping to their schedules as best they could. But horses and omnibuses, they could only do so much. As London grew, as the population swelled, it became clear that the city needed something bigger, something faster, something that could move masses of people without clogging the streets even further. And that's where the trains came in. The railway revolution transformed Victorian London in ways that are hard to overstate. The first passenger railway in London, the London and Greenwich Railway, opened in 1836. It was a marvel of engineering, an elevated track that carried passengers above the crowded streets. People flocked to see it, to ride it, to experience this new technology. And it worked. Trains were faster than horses, more reliable than omnibuses, and they could carry far more people at once. Soon, railway lines spread across London like veins. Stations popped up everywhere. Grand structures like King's Cross, Paddington, and St. Pancras became landmarks in their own right. These weren't just functional buildings. They were architectural masterpieces, designed to impress, to inspire awe. Walking into one of these stations was like stepping into a cathedral of progress. The soaring ceilings, the iron and glass structures, the steam hissing from locomotives. It was a sensory experience that captured the spirit of the age. And then came the Underground. The Metropolitan Railway, the world's first underground railway, opened in 1863. It was a bold, audacious idea, digging tunnels beneath the city, laying tracks underground, running trains through the darkness. Many people thought it was insane, but it worked. The Underground allowed Londoners to travel quickly and efficiently, avoiding the congested streets above. It was smoky, it was dark, it was claustrophobic, but it was also brilliant. And it changed everything. But here's the thing about Victorian London. It wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. Life in this era was shaped by rituals, by traditions, by cultural norms that seem strange to us today. And nothing was more elaborate, more consuming than the culture of mourning. The Victorians didn't just mourn their dead, they performed mourning. It was an art form, a social obligation, a way of life that could last for years. When someone died, especially someone important, the entire household, sometimes the entire community, would plunge into a carefully orchestrated period of grief. And this wasn't just about feeling sad. This was about showing the world that you were sad in very specific, very visible ways. It all started with Queen Victoria herself. When her beloved husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861, the Queen was devastated. She withdrew from public life, wore black for the rest of her days, and transformed Windsor Castle into a shrine to his memory. His rooms were kept exactly as he left them, his clothes laid out, his personal items untouched. She even had his chamber pot filled with fresh water every day, as if he might return at any moment. The Queen's grief became legendary, and it set the tone for the entire nation. If the Queen mourned this way, then so should everyone else. Mourning became fashionable, expected, almost competitive. People wanted to show that they grieved properly, that they respected the dead, that they understood the gravity of loss. And so, a whole industry sprang up around death and mourning. Entire businesses dedicated themselves to helping people grieve in style. Let's talk about mourning clothes first. When someone died, you couldn't just throw on something black from your closet and call it a day. Oh no, there were rules, strict rules. For a widow, the mourning period could last up to 2.5 years. 2.5 years. During the first year, she had to wear full mourning dress, heavy black fabric, usually bombazine or crepe, that was dull and non-reflective. No jewelry except jet, a black gemstone that was considered appropriate for mourning. No colors, no patterns, nothing that suggested joy or frivolity. After the first year, she could move into second mourning, which allowed for slightly less severe black clothing, maybe with some white trim or gray accents. And finally, half mourning, where she could wear muted colors like gray, mauve, or lavender. But even then, she had to be careful. Wearing bright colors too soon could bring scandal, gossip, social exile. People watched, people judged. Men had it somewhat easier, but they still had to follow the rules. A widower might wear a black armband, a black suit, and a black hatband. The mourning period for men was usually shorter, maybe 6 months to a year, depending on the relationship to the deceased. But the expectations were still there. You mourned visibly, or you faced consequences. Children weren't exempt either. Even young kids were dressed in black, sometimes for months. Imagine being a child in Victorian London, losing a parent or sibling, and then being forced to wear uncomfortable, somber clothing for a year or more. It must have been suffocating, but that was the culture. Death was everywhere, and grief was performed publicly. Now, let's talk about the mourning business itself. This was a boom industry. Shops specialized in mourning attire, offering everything from black dresses to veils to gloves to handkerchiefs. Some stores, like Jay's London General Mourning Warehouse, became famous for their extensive selections. You could walk in after a death in the family and walk out fully outfitted for months of mourning. They had it all figured out. But it wasn't just clothing. There was mourning jewelry, intricate pieces made from jet, onyx, or even woven from the hair of the deceased. Yes, you read that right. Hair jewelry. Victorians would take locks of hair from their dead loved ones and have them fashioned into brooches, rings, bracelets, even elaborate wreaths. It sounds macabre to us now, but to them, it was a way of keeping the deceased close, of honoring their memory in a tangible way. Then there were mourning cards. When someone died, families would send out black-bordered cards announcing the death. These cards were elaborate, often featuring poems, religious verses, or images of weeping willows and urns. Receiving one meant you were expected to acknowledge the death, to pay your respects, to follow the appropriate mourning protocols yourself. Funerals were another massive production. A proper Victorian funeral was an expensive affair. The wealthy would hire professional mourners. People paid to cry and wail at the funeral to add to the spectacle of grief. Horses pulling the hearse would be adorned with black plumes. The coffin would be elaborate, polished wood with silver or brass fixtures. The procession through the streets would be slow and solemn, designed to draw attention, to show the community that this person mattered. For the working class, a proper funeral could be financially devastating, but people saved for it anyway. Burial clubs and funeral insurance schemes became popular, allowing families to pay small amounts over time so they could afford a decent burial when the time came. No one wanted a pauper's funeral, where the body would be dumped in an unmarked grave. Dignity in death mattered, sometimes more than comfort in life. And then there were the cemeteries themselves. Victorian London was running out of space for the dead. The old churchyards were overflowing, literally. Bodies were buried on top of bodies, sometimes just a few feet apart. The smell was horrendous. Disease spread. Something had to be done. The solution? The great garden cemeteries. In the 1830s and 40s, a series of magnificent cemeteries were built on the outskirts of London. Places like Highgate Cemetery, Kensal Green, and Brompton Cemetery. These weren't just burial grounds. They were landscaped parks, designed to be beautiful, peaceful, almost park-like. People would actually visit cemeteries for leisure, strolling through the tree-lined paths, admiring the elaborate tombs and monuments. Wealthy families competed to have the most impressive tombs, grand mausoleums, towering obelisks, weeping angels carved from marble. These became status symbols. Even in death, you wanted to show that you mattered, that you had means, that you would be remembered. But here's where it gets interesting. While all this mourning culture was happening, while London was building elaborate cemeteries and dressing in black, the city itself was still struggling with the basics of transportation. Remember those horses we talked about? They weren't just creating mess in the streets, they were dying too. And in large numbers. A working horse in Victorian London had a hard life. They labored long hours, pulling heavy loads through congested streets. Many were poorly treated, underfed, overworked. And when they collapsed, which happened often, they were often just left where they fell. Dead horses on the streets became a common sight. It could take hours, sometimes days, for someone to come and remove the carcass. In the meantime, the body would bloat in the sun, attracting flies and rats, adding to the general misery of urban life. The irony wasn't lost on some observers. Here was a society that obsessed over the proper mourning of human dead, that built grand cemeteries and wore elaborate mourning dress, but treated the deaths of the animals that powered their entire transportation system as mere inconveniences. It was a strange contradiction, but that was Victorian London, a city of contrasts, of progress and problems, of beauty and filth existing side by side. Back to the trains, though, because while the streets were chaotic, the railways were transforming everything. The underground was expanding rapidly. By the 1880s, multiple lines crisscrossed beneath the city. The Circle Line, the District Line, the Metropolitan Line. They connected different parts of London in ways that had never been possible before. You could live in the suburbs now, in places like Hammersmith or Paddington or Islington, and commute into the city center for work. This was revolutionary. But riding the early underground wasn't pleasant. The trains were powered by steam locomotives, which meant the tunnels filled with smoke and soot. Passengers would emerge from their journeys covered in grime, coughing from the fumes. Ventilation was poor. The air was thick and hot. Some people found it unbearable. But others, they adapted, because the speed and convenience outweighed the discomfort. You could travel in 15 minutes what would have taken an hour by omnibus. That was worth a little smoke. And then there was the social aspect of train travel. The railways brought together people from all walks of life, crammed into compartments where class distinctions became uncomfortably obvious. First-class carriages were plush, comfortable, with padded seats and plenty of space. Second class was serviceable, adequate for the middle classes who couldn't quite afford first but didn't want to mix with the masses. And then there was third class. Third-class carriages were brutal, hard wooden benches, no cushions, often no roof in the early days. You'd be exposed to the elements, rain pouring in, wind whipping through. It was transportation at its most basic, but it was cheap, and for working-class Londoners, it was the only option. They endured the discomfort because the alternative was walking for miles, or spending precious pennies on an omnibus that might not even have space. The class divisions on trains mirrored the class divisions in Victorian society as a whole. This was a world where your social standing determined almost everything. Where you lived, how you traveled, how you mourned, even where you'd be buried. The wealthy had their private carriages and first-class compartments. The poor had their crowded omnibuses and third-class benches. And the middle class, they navigated somewhere in between, always striving upward, always aware of who was above and below them. But let's get back to mourning, because we're only scratching the surface of how deeply this culture penetrated Victorian life. Death wasn't just acknowledged in Victorian London, it was everywhere. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. Disease, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis swept through neighborhoods regularly. Medical care was primitive by our standards. People died young. They died suddenly, and they died often. This constant presence of death shaped how Victorians thought about life. There was a fatalism, an acceptance that death could come at any moment, but there was also a fierce desire to make death meaningful, to give it dignity, to ensure that the departed were remembered properly. Photography played a fascinating role in this. Post-mortem photography became incredibly popular during the Victorian era. When someone died, especially a child, families would hire a photographer to take pictures of the deceased. Sometimes the body would be posed to look as if they were sleeping. Other times, especially with children, they'd be propped up and photographed with living family members. One last portrait together. To modern sensibilities, this seems morbid, disturbing even. But to the Victorians, it made perfect sense. Photography was still relatively new and expensive. Many families couldn't afford to have pictures taken during life. So the moment of death, tragic as it was, became the one opportunity to capture an image of their loved one. Something tangible to remember them by. Something to hold on to when the grief became too much. These photographs would be displayed in the home, sometimes in elaborate frames. Visitors would see them. It was part of the mourning process, part of keeping the memory alive. And remember, in a time before modern embalming techniques, before refrigeration, bodies had to be photographed and buried quickly. You had maybe a day or two. So these post-mortem sessions happened fast, often within hours of death. Spiritualism also exploded during this period. When you're surrounded by death, when you're losing children, parents, spouses, the desire to connect with them beyond the grave becomes overwhelming. The Victorian era saw a massive rise in seances, mediums, spiritualist societies. People desperately wanted to believe that death wasn't the end, that they could still communicate with those they'd lost. Mediums would hold sessions in darkened rooms, claiming to channel spirits, to deliver messages from the other side. Some were obvious frauds, using tricks and illusions to deceive grieving families. But others were more subtle, playing on people's emotions, their vulnerability, their desperate need for comfort. And people believed. Even prominent figures, scientists, writers, intellectuals, attended seances and came away convinced they'd spoken with the dead. Queen Victoria herself, still deep in mourning for Albert, reportedly consulted mediums. She wanted to believe her husband was still with her somehow, watching over her, approving of her decisions. Whether she truly believed or simply found comfort in the ritual, we can't know for certain. But her interest in spiritualism gave it legitimacy, made it socially acceptable for others to explore. Now, while all this spiritual seeking was happening, while people were photographing their dead and attending seances, London's transportation system kept evolving. The omnibus companies were getting more sophisticated, routes were being optimized, competition was fierce, and in 1856, something significant happened. The London General Omnibus Company was formed, consolidating many smaller operations into one large entity. This consolidation brought standardization. The buses became more uniform, the routes more reliable, the service more consistent. The LGOC, as it became known, painted all its buses red. Yes, red. This is where London's iconic red buses originated. Not from some grand design decision, but from a practical business choice by one company trying to establish a recognizable brand. The red buses became a symbol of London itself. They were everywhere, rattling through the streets, picking up and dropping off passengers at designated stops. The conductors, standing on the back platform, would call out destinations, collect fares, help passengers on and off. It was a well-oiled system, or at least as well-oiled as anything could be in chaotic Victorian London. But the horses, those poor horses, they were still struggling. The demand for horse-drawn transport was insatiable, and the supply of horses couldn't keep up. Horses were being imported from all over, from Ireland, from the countryside, from abroad. They'd be brought to London, worked until they dropped, and then replaced. It was brutal, and it was unsustainable. Some people saw this coming. Even in the Victorian era, there were those who recognized that relying entirely on horses was a problem. The manure crisis, the dead animals in the streets, the sheer logistics of feeding and housing hundreds of thousands of horses, it was becoming unmanageable. Cities around the world were facing the same issue. In New York, in Paris, in Berlin, they predicted that cities would be buried under horse waste within decades. But then, something unexpected happened. Technology advanced. The electric tram arrived. The internal combustion engine was developed. Motor cars began appearing on London streets in the 1890s. They were rare at first, expensive, unreliable, but they represented the future, a future where horses wouldn't be needed at all. Of course, the Victorians didn't know this yet. In the 1880s and 90s, horses were still king. The streets were still filled with their sounds. The clip-clop of hooves on cobblestones, the jangle of harnesses, the shouts of drivers, and the omnibuses, those red double-deckers, were still pulled by teams of horses 3 or 4 at a time, straining against their loads. Inside these omnibuses, Londoners of all classes sat together, albeit sometimes uncomfortably. A clerk heading to work in the city, a shopgirl traveling to her position in a department store, a gentleman going to his club, they'd all be squeezed onto the same bus, sharing the same bumpy ride, breathing the same close air. Class distinctions mattered, but on the omnibus, everyone was just trying to get somewhere. The railway stations, meanwhile, were becoming busier than ever. Paddington, serving the west; King's Cross, serving the north; Liverpool Street, serving the east; Waterloo, serving the south. These great terminals were the gateways to London, where trains arrived and departed constantly, where thousands of people flowed in and out every day. And beneath it all, literally beneath the streets, the underground trains rumbled through their tunnels. By now, there were multiple lines, intersecting at key stations like Baker Street and King's Cross. You could transfer from one line to another. You could plan complex journeys across the city. Maps were being produced, showing the growing network of underground railways. It was becoming a system, a web connecting all parts of London. But let's not forget, this was still Victorian London. This was still a city where death was never far away, where mourning rituals dominated social life, where the living and the dead existed in strange proximity. The cemeteries we mentioned earlier, those grand Victorian garden cemeteries, they weren't just places for burial. They became destinations. On Sundays, families would dress up and take outings to visit their loved ones' graves. They'd bring flowers, tend to the plots, maybe have a quiet picnic nearby. It sounds strange to us now, but for the Victorians, the cemetery was a place of beauty, a place of peace, a refuge from the noise and chaos of the city. Highgate Cemetery, in particular, became famous. Opened in 1839, it was designed to be spectacular. Winding paths through lush greenery, Egyptian-style architecture at the entrance, the famous Circle of Lebanon, where tombs were built in a ring around an ancient cedar tree, catacombs cut into the hillside. It was Gothic, romantic, almost theatrical. People paid to be buried there. It was prestigious. And the monuments? Oh, the monuments were extraordinary. Wealthy families commissioned elaborate sculptures. Angels with outstretched wings. Grieving women draped in stone robes. Columns topped with urns. Some tombs were like small chapels, complete with stained glass and interior spaces where families could gather. These weren't just markers. They were statements. In death as in life, you displayed your wealth, your taste, your importance. But not everyone could afford Highgate or Kensal Green. For the poor, burial remained a constant worry. The fear of a pauper's funeral, of being buried in a mass grave with no marker, haunted working-class families. They'd scrimp and save, go without food if necessary, just to ensure they could afford a proper send-off. Burial clubs became essential. You'd pay a few pennies a week into a fund. When you died, the club would cover the funeral costs. It was insurance, but it was also community. These clubs were often organized through pubs or churches or workplaces. Everyone knew everyone. When someone died, the whole group would turn out for the funeral. It was solidarity in the face of death. And then there were the funeral mutes. These were professional mourners, usually men, who would stand outside the deceased's home during the funeral. Dressed entirely in black, sometimes holding staffs or wearing special badges, they'd maintain solemn expressions. adding to the gravity of the occasion. They didn't speak, hence mutes, but their presence signified that this was an important funeral, that the deceased mattered, that proper respect was being shown. For a truly grand funeral, you might hire dozens of mutes. They'd line the street, they'd follow the hearse in procession. The more mutes you had, the more impressive the funeral appeared. It was theater, pure theater, but it served a purpose. It gave structure to grief. It gave the community a way to acknowledge loss collectively. Now, imagine this scene, a funeral procession moving through Victorian London's crowded streets. The hearse, ornate and heavy, pulled by black horses with elaborate plumes. The mutes walking in formation, the family following in mourning coaches. The whole procession moving slowly, deliberately, while around them, life continues. Omnibuses passing by, street vendors calling out their wares, workers hurrying to catch trains, the dead and the living, occupying the same space, moving through the same streets. This was the reality of Victorian London. Death wasn't hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes like it is today. It happened at home. Bodies were prepared at home, laid out in the parlor. That's where the term funeral parlor comes from. Neighbors would come to pay respects. The body might lie there for days, depending on the season, depending on how quickly arrangements could be made. And during this time, the house would be marked. Black crepe would be hung on the door. The curtains would be drawn. Sometimes mirrors would be covered, a superstition that the spirit of the deceased might get trapped in the reflection. Clocks might be stopped at the time of death. These rituals, these small acts, they helped the living process what had happened. They created a boundary between the time before death and the time after. Children grew up immersed in this culture. They learned about death early. They attended funerals. They wore mourning clothes. They were taught the proper etiquette, when to speak, when to stay silent, how to express condolences. Death wasn't taboo. It was part of life. Expected, inevitable. But here's what's fascinating. Despite this constant proximity to death, despite the elaborate mourning rituals, Victorians were also incredibly forward-looking. They were building railways and bridges and tunnels. They were expanding the empire. They were innovating in science and industry. They lived with one foot in the past, honoring tradition and ritual, and one foot in the future, embracing progress and change. The trains exemplified this duality. Here was cutting-edge technology, steam power, engineering marvels, transforming how people lived and worked. But the trains also carried coffins. Special funeral trains would transport bodies from London to burial sites in the countryside. The dead traveled by rail, just like the living. The London Necropolis Railway, established in 1854, ran regular services from Waterloo to Brookwood Cemetery in Surrey. You could book passage for yourself and your deceased loved one. There were separate stations, separate waiting rooms, even separate classes for the dead: first-class corpses, third-class corpses. The class system extended beyond life. The Necropolis Railway solved a practical problem. London cemeteries were full. Brookwood, with its 2,000 acres, offered space, but it was 25 miles away, too far to transport bodies by horse-drawn hearse. The train made it possible, and families could travel with their dead, attend a burial, and return to London the same day. It was efficient, it was modern, it was very Victorian. Back on the streets, the omnibus system kept growing. By the 1880s, there were over 600 omnibuses operating in London. The routes covered most of the city. You could get almost anywhere for a few pennies. The system wasn't perfect. Buses broke down, horses went lame, traffic jams were common, but it worked, more or less. The drivers and conductors, they were working-class heroes in their own way. Long hours, low pay, constant interaction with the public. They had to know the routes intimately, had to handle difficult passengers, had to keep to schedules despite impossible conditions. Many of them lived near the omnibus depots, in cramped housing, supporting families on meager wages. But they took pride in their work. A good driver, one who could navigate the chaos with skill, was respected. And the horses, those patient, suffering horses, they kept going, fed oats and hay at the depots, watered at troughs stationed throughout the city, shod by blacksmiths working in small shops on nearly every corner. The whole city revolved around these animals. Entire industries supported them: hay merchants, harness makers, veterinarians. Though veterinary science was still primitive, when a horse got sick or injured, it was often simply destroyed and replaced. The lifespan of a working horse in London was short, maybe 3 to 5 years of hard labor before they broke down. Then they'd be sold off, perhaps to pull lighter loads in the countryside, or sent to the knacker's yard to be slaughtered. Their meat might end up in dog food, their bones ground up for fertilizer, their hides tanned for leather. Nothing was wasted. But their lives were hard and brief. Some people cared. Animal welfare movements were beginning to form. The Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, founded in 1824, was gaining influence. They'd prosecute cases of obvious abuse. But they couldn't change the fundamental reality. London needed horses, hundreds of thousands of them, and the demand was relentless. Meanwhile, the underground was experiencing its own evolution. The early steam-powered lines were successful, but miserable to ride. The smoke problem was getting worse as traffic increased. Engineers worked on ventilation systems, cutting shafts to the surface, installing powerful fans. It helped somewhat, but the tunnels remained hot, stuffy, and filled with soot. Women traveling on the underground would carry wet handkerchiefs, pressing them over their noses and mouths to filter the air. Men's collars would be blackened by the time they reached their destinations. But despite the discomfort, ridership kept climbing. In 1880, the Metropolitan Railway alone carried over 40 million passengers. Think about that number. 40 million journeys in a single year on just one line. The demand was staggering, and it proved that Londoners were willing to endure almost anything for the sake of speed and convenience. New stations opened regularly, each one designed to handle the growing crowds. Platforms were extended, ticket halls expanded, the infrastructure kept adapting, and the technology kept improving too. In 1890, the first deep-level electric railway opened. The City and South London Railway. This was revolutionary. Electric trains running through deep tunnels. No steam, no smoke. The future had arrived. These electric trains were nicknamed padded cells because the carriages were windowless, heavily upholstered, and felt claustrophobic. But they were clean, they were fast, and they pointed the way forward. Within a few years, more electric lines would be built. The Central London Railway, the Great Northern and City Railway. The age of the electric underground was beginning. Back above ground, mourning culture continued to evolve. By the 1880s and 90s, some people were starting to question the elaborate rituals. Was all this display really necessary? Did grief need to be performed so publicly? Reformers argued that the mourning industry had become exploitative, that businesses were profiting from people's pain. that the rules had become too rigid, too expensive, too oppressive. But tradition held strong. Queen Victoria was still alive, still in mourning, still setting the example, and most of society followed her lead. To abandon mourning dress prematurely, to cut short the mourning period, to show joy too soon after a death, these were serious social offenses. You could be ostracized. Your reputation could be ruined, so people followed the rules, even if privately they chafed against them. Women bore the brunt of this burden. Men could return to work relatively quickly, could resume normal activities with only minor adjustments to their appearance. But women, especially widows, were expected to withdraw from society. No parties, no theater, no bright colors, no frivolity. For years, some widows, particularly if they were young, found this unbearable. Their lives were essentially put on hold, their youth wasted in black crape. And what about remarriage? A widow remarrying too soon could cause scandal. There were unwritten rules about timing. Generally, 2 years of mourning before even considering it. And even then, she had to be careful. Too much enthusiasm for a new match suggested she hadn't properly grieved the old one. Society watched. Society judged. The mourning jewelry industry adapted to these pressures. Pieces became more elaborate, more expensive. Jet jewelry from Whitby, on the Yorkshire coast, became especially prized. Jet is fossilized wood. Lightweight, but deep black. Perfect for mourning wear. Craftsmen in Whitby employed hundreds of workers, carving intricate designs, creating everything from simple beads to elaborate necklaces and bracelets. Hair jewelry reached its peak during this period. Entire workshops specialized in working with human hair. They'd weave it into patterns, create flowers and leaves, incorporate it into lockets and brooches. Some pieces contained hair from multiple family members, creating a kind of genealogical record. You'd have strands from your mother, your grandmother, your children, all woven together. It was intimate, personal, and to Victorian sensibilities, beautiful. But let's shift perspective for a moment. Let's think about what it was actually like to live in this city, day to day. You wake up in Victorian London. Maybe you're a clerk, working in one of the many offices in the city, London's financial district. You live in Islington, a northern suburb, in a modest row house. You share it with your wife and 3 children. 2 rooms downstairs, 2 rooms upstairs, an outdoor privy in the backyard. You dress for work. Dark suit, white shirt with a stiff collar, bowler hat. It's winter, so you add a heavy coat. You step outside into the cold morning air. The street is already busy. Horse-drawn carts delivering coal and milk. Your neighbors heading to work. Children on their way to school. The smell of smoke from coal fires, mixed with the ever-present smell of horse manure, fills your nostrils. You walk to the omnibus stop. Several other men are waiting. The bus arrives, red, pulled by 3 tired-looking horses. It's already crowded. You squeeze onto the upper deck, the open-air section, because it's cheaper than sitting inside. The wind bites. The ride is bumpy. But within 30 minutes, you're in central London. From there, you might transfer to the underground, down the steps into the station. The smell hits you immediately. That distinctive combination of smoke, dampness, and humanity. You buy your ticket, a small piece of cardboard, and push through the turnstile. The platform is packed. Everyone waiting, watching the tunnel mouth. You hear it before you see it. The rumble, the screech of metal on metal. Then the train bursts from the tunnel, wreathed in steam. The doors open. People pour out. You push your way in. Find a spot to stand. The doors close, and you're off, rattling through the darkness, stopping at each station. More people getting on and off. The air is thick. Someone coughs. You hold on to the strap overhead, swaying with the motion of the train. Finally, your stop. You emerge back into daylight, or what passes for daylight in foggy London. You walk the final few blocks to your office, clock in, sit at your desk, begin your day of copying figures into ledgers. Hour after hour, the same routine, 5.5 days a week. This was life for millions of Londoners. Repetitive, exhausting, but also relatively new. Your father might have been a farmer or a craftsman working from home, but you're part of the new economy, the industrial economy, the urban economy, and the transportation system, the omnibuses and trains. They make it possible. Without them, you couldn't live in Islington and work in the city. You'd have to live in some cramped room near your workplace, or walk for hours each day. So yes, the transportation was uncomfortable, crowded, dirty. But it expanded possibilities. It allowed the city to spread. It created suburbs. It separated work from home. For better or worse, it reshaped how people lived. And when death came, as it inevitably did, you'd navigate that system too. When your elderly father passed away, you'd arrange the funeral, order the mourning clothes for your family, commission a headstone, host the wake, follow all the rituals. Because that's what you did. That's what society expected. Your wife would go into full mourning, black dress, black veil. She'd withdraw from her friends, stop attending church socials, focus entirely on home and grief. Your children would wear black armbands, learn to be solemn, learn that death was serious, sacred, demanding respect. And then, after the funeral, after the burial, life would slowly return to normal, but not quickly. Never quickly. The mourning period stretched on. Months became a year. A year became longer. And all the while, you'd return to your routine. The omnibus, the underground, the office. Work continued. Bills had to be paid. Life, despite death, carried on. But here's something interesting about Victorian mourning culture. It wasn't just about sadness, it was also about memory, about keeping the dead present in your life. Victorian homes were filled with remembrances. Photographs of the deceased displayed prominently. Locks of hair in lockets, memorial cards arranged on mantelpieces. The dead weren't forgotten. They remained part of the household, part of the family, even in absence. Some families created entire memorial corners, a small table with photographs, flowers, perhaps a Bible open to a favorite verse. Visitors would see these displays and understand immediately who had been lost. It was a conversation starter, a way to keep talking about the deceased, to keep their memory alive through stories and shared grief. Children were taught to remember, to honor their dead siblings, their grandparents, their parents if orphaned. Memorial days would be observed. The anniversary of a death might be marked with a visit to the grave, with prayers, with quiet reflection. Death anniversaries were as important as birthdays, maybe more so. This constant engagement with death and memory shaped Victorian psychology in profound ways. People lived with loss differently than we do today. They didn't try to move on quickly. Those concepts would have seemed strange, even disrespectful. Instead, they integrated loss into their ongoing lives. The dead remained present. Grief was not something to overcome, but something to carry, to honor, to express continuously. Now, let's return to the streets. Because while all this mourning was happening in private homes, the city itself was transforming. By the 1890s, London was the largest city in the world. Over 5 million people. The most powerful city in the most powerful empire. And it was straining under its own success. The horse problem had reached crisis levels. The streets were, quite literally, drowning in manure. On a typical day, with 300,000 horses working, they'd collectively produce around 3 million pounds of manure. 3 million pounds. Every single day. Plus thousands of gallons of urine. The crossing sweepers, poor souls whose job was to clear paths through the muck for pedestrians, were overwhelmed. They'd work constantly, sweeping waste aside, earning pennies and tips from grateful walkers, but they couldn't keep up. The manure piled up along curbs. It got tracked into shops and homes. When it dried, it turned to powder and was blown about by wind, getting into eyes and lungs. When it rained, it turned into a toxic soup flowing through the gutters. The smell, especially in summer, was overwhelming. Respiratory diseases flourished. Typhoid and cholera outbreaks were common. The horses that powered the city were also poisoning it. City planners held meetings, wrote reports, debated solutions. Some proposed building raised pedestrian walkways above street level. Others suggested elaborate sewer systems just for horse waste. A few forward-thinking individuals suggested that maybe, just maybe, horses weren't the answer. But what was the alternative? Motor cars were still rare, expensive, unreliable. Electric trams were being tested, but weren't widespread yet. Bicycles were popular, but couldn't replace horses for heavy hauling. So the horses remained, and the omnibus companies kept buying more. The London General Omnibus Company alone owned over 16,000 horses by the 1890s. 16,000. They had massive stables, veterinary staff, blacksmiths, feed suppliers. It was an enormous operation. And every other omnibus company, every freight company, every private carriage owner, they all needed horses too. The demand affected the entire country. Ireland, which bred excellent draft horses, exported thousands annually to England. Horse fairs in rural towns became major economic events. Dealers would buy horses, transport them to London, sell them to transport companies. The markup was substantial, but so was the turnover. Remember, working horses in London lasted only a few years. The demand never stopped. And when horses died, which they did constantly, their bodies had to be disposed of. The knackers' yards on the outskirts of London processed thousands of carcasses. They'd salvage everything: meat for animal feed, bones for fertilizer and glue, hides for leather. Even the hooves were used, boiled down for gelatin. It was grim work, but profitable. Death, whether human or animal, generated business. Meanwhile, the railway network kept expanding. Branch lines reached further into the suburbs. Commuter traffic increased. More and more people were living outside central London and traveling in for work. This created new neighborhoods. Areas that had been farmland or small villages suddenly became residential districts. Houses were built. Schools opened. Shops appeared. All because a railway station had been built nearby. This suburban expansion changed the character of London. The city spread. The dense, crowded core remained. But around it, looser, more spacious neighborhoods developed. Middle-class families could afford small houses with gardens, fresh air, quieter streets, and thanks to the trains, the commute was manageable. An hour each way, not pleasant, but doable. But not everyone could afford to move to the suburbs. The working poor remained in the inner city, in slums like Whitechapel, St. Giles, Southwark. These were neighborhoods of desperate poverty, overcrowded tenements, entire families living in single rooms, no running water, no sanitation, disease rampant, crime common. These were the neighborhoods where Jack the Ripper would hunt in 1888, his crimes shocking the world, exposing the dark underbelly of this great imperial city. The contrast was stark. Wealthy Londoners traveled in private carriages, lived in grand townhouses, wore expensive mourning jewelry when tragedy struck. Poor Londoners walked, lived in squalor, couldn't afford proper funerals. The same city, the same streets, but utterly different experiences. And yet, they shared the same transportation infrastructure. The omnibuses carried everyone. The underground trains served all classes, albeit in separate carriages. When you rode the bus, you might sit next to a factory worker, a shopkeeper, a governess, maybe even a gentleman who'd chosen the cheap option that day. The city mixed people together, even as it maintained rigid class boundaries. The conductors on the omnibuses saw it all. They were observers of London life. They'd help elderly ladies onto the bus, exchange jokes with regular passengers, break up arguments, watch courting couples, spot pickpockets, assist mourners traveling to funerals. They were part of the fabric of the city, witnesses to thousands of small human dramas playing out daily, and the drivers, perched high on their seats, had their own perspective. They'd navigate the chaos below, watching for pedestrians darting across streets, avoiding other vehicles, keeping the horses moving. It required skill, quick reflexes, intimate knowledge of the routes. A good driver knew every turn, every hill, where the potholes were, where traffic always jammed up. Some drivers became local celebrities, known for their skill, their wit, their kindness to passengers. People would wait for their bus specifically, prefer their route, trust their judgment. In a city of millions, these small personal connections mattered. Back underground, the electric railways were proving their worth. The City and South London Railway, despite its windowless, padded cell carriages, was a success. It demonstrated that electric power was viable. More importantly, it was pleasant. No smoke, no soot, just clean, quiet, efficient travel. Investors took notice. Plans were drawn up for more electric lines. The deep-level tube railways that would eventually become the modern underground system were beginning to take shape. These would run far beneath the surface, too deep for steam trains, perfect for electric power. They'd revolutionize London transportation once again. But that revolution was still coming. In the 1880s and 90s, most travel was still by horse-drawn omnibus or steam-powered underground. The transition to electric power, to motor vehicles, was on the horizon, but not yet realized. Victorian London was caught between past and future, between old technologies and new possibilities. And in this in-between moment, this liminal space, where tradition met innovation, Londoners adapted as they always had. They complained about the crowds, the smell, the delays, but they kept riding. They kept moving, because the city demanded it. To live in Victorian London was to be constantly in motion, traveling between work and home, between the living and the dead, between past and future. The railway stations themselves became monuments to this duality. Look at St. Pancras, completed in 1868. The facade was pure Gothic revival, red brick and soaring spires, romantic and medieval. But behind that facade, modern engineering, iron and glass. A massive train shed, spanning over 700 feet. The largest single-span roof in the world at the time. It was the past clothing the future. Victorian architecture at its most symbolic. Or consider Tower Bridge, begun in 1886 and finished in 1894. It looks like a medieval castle with its twin towers and Gothic detailing. But the mechanism? Cutting-edge hydraulic engineering. The bridge could lift to allow tall ships to pass. Ancient appearance, modern function. This was Victorian London's signature aesthetic. Progress disguised as tradition. The same principles applied to mourning. The rituals seemed ancient, timeless, rooted in centuries of custom, but many of them were actually quite new. The elaborate mourning industry, the strict rules about dress and behavior. Much of this had only developed in the early 19th century. It wasn't ancient tradition. It was recent invention. But it felt traditional, and in Victorian society, that mattered. Queen Victoria's long mourning for Albert set the standard, but it also trapped her. By the 1880s, she'd been in mourning for over 20 years. She was known as the Widow of Windsor, rarely appearing in public, always dressed in black. Some criticized her withdrawal. The empire needed its queen. But Victoria couldn't, or wouldn't, change. Her grief had become her identity, and yet, paradoxically, her reign was defined by progress. The Victorian era saw incredible advances. Railways, telegraphs, photography, medicine, industry, science. The empire expanded to cover a quarter of the world's landmass. British power was at its zenith, all while the queen who gave her name to the age sat in black-draped rooms, mourning her dead husband. This tension between progress and tradition, between innovation and ritual, it defined the entire era. And nowhere was it more visible than in how people moved through the city. Ancient streets, modern transport, horse-drawn vehicles, steam trains, electric power, all coexisting, all competing for space. Let's think about a specific moment. Let's say it's 1890. You're standing at the corner of Oxford Street and Tottenham Court Road, one of the busiest intersections in London. What do you see? Dozens of omnibuses, red and green and yellow, each company with its own colors. Hansoms, cabs, those distinctive two-wheeled carriages darting through traffic, private carriages carrying wealthy passengers, delivery wagons loaded with goods, pedestrians by the hundreds, streaming across the street, dodging vehicles. The noise would be incredible. Horses neighing, wheels on cobblestones, drivers shouting, vendors calling out, street musicians playing, newsboys hawking papers, a constant cacophony, and the movement, everything in motion, swirling, chaotic, somehow functioning despite the apparent disorder. Now imagine, in that same scene, a funeral procession passing through. The traffic parts. People stop. Hats are removed. The hearse rolls by slowly, solemnly. The horses, black plumes bobbing. The mourners follow. And then, once they've passed, The chaos resumes, life and death, sharing the same space, acknowledged but not dwelling on each other. This was the rhythm of Victorian London, work and mourning, progress and ritual. The practical and the symbolic, all intertwined, all necessary. The omnibus companies understood this. They ran special funeral services, charging premium rates to transport mourners to cemeteries. The buses would be cleaned, decorated appropriately. The drivers would wear formal attire. It was another revenue stream, another way to serve the city's needs. And speaking of needs, let's talk about the invisible workers who kept this transportation system running, the stable boys who fed and groomed the horses, the blacksmiths who shod them, the harness makers who crafted and repaired the leather work, the wheelwrights who built and maintained the omnibus wheels, the carriage builders who constructed the vehicles, the ticket sellers, the depot managers, the veterinarians. Thousands of people, employed in jobs that existed solely to support horse-drawn transport. Their livelihoods depended on the system continuing. When motorized vehicles eventually arrived, when horses were phased out, all these jobs would disappear. Entire trades would become obsolete. But in the 1880s and 90s, that future was unimaginable. Horses seemed permanent, essential, irreplaceable. The same was true for the mourning industry. The dressmakers specializing in mourning wear, the jet carvers in Whitby, the manufacturers of black crepe, the printers of memorial cards, the undertakers, the coffin makers, the grave diggers, hundreds of businesses, thousands of workers, all dependent on death remaining a major social event, requiring elaborate preparation and expenditure. Both systems, transportation and mourning, had become enormous economic engines. They employed people, generated wealth, shaped urban life, and both seemed permanent, natural, part of the eternal order of things. But change was coming. In 1896, the first motor bus appeared on London streets. It was experimental, unreliable, but it worked. Within 20 years, motor buses would replace horse-drawn omnibuses entirely. The age of the horse would end. The great manure crisis would solve itself through technological replacement. Similarly, attitudes toward mourning were beginning to shift. Younger generations questioned the elaborate rituals, the long periods of seclusion, the expensive requirements. Some openly rebelled, cutting short their mourning, wearing colors prematurely, refusing to follow all the rules. The old guard was scandalized, but the tide was turning. Queen Victoria's death in 1901 would mark a symbolic turning point. The woman who embodied elaborate mourning, who defined the era, would be gone. Her son, Edward VII, would bring a different sensibility, lighter, more modern, less obsessed with death and memory. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In the 1880s and 90s, Victorian mourning culture was still at its peak, and the transportation system, despite its problems, was expanding and improving. The city was growing. The population was increasing. And somehow, through a combination of horses, trains, and human ingenuity, London kept moving. Think about what an achievement this was. 5 million people, living together, working together, traveling together, in an age before computers, before modern logistics, before most of the technologies we take for granted. They made it work. Through trial and error, through incremental improvements, through sheer determination, The underground map was becoming more complex. More lines, more connections, more possibilities. You could travel from Hammersmith to Whitechapel, from Paddington to the city, from King's Cross to Elephant and Castle. The network was filling in, covering more of the city, becoming truly useful as a transportation system rather than just a novelty. Above ground, the omnibus routes were being rationalized. The London General Omnibus Company was consolidating its control, standardizing services, improving reliability. Yes, the buses were still crowded. Yes, they were still slow in traffic, but they ran on schedule, more or less. You could plan your journey, know when to expect the bus. That predictability mattered. And the horses? They kept working, kept pulling, kept serving. Their suffering was invisible to most Londoners. Just part of the landscape, part of how things worked. A necessary sacrifice for urban life. Only a few animal welfare advocates raised concerns, and they were largely ignored. The same could be said for the working poor. Their suffering was invisible too, tucked away in slums, working brutal hours for minimal pay, living in conditions we'd consider uninhabitable. But Victorian society, for the most part, accepted this as natural. The social order seemed fixed, inevitable. Some people were born to wealth, others to poverty. That's just how it was. But beneath the surface, tensions were building. Labor movements were organizing. Socialists were agitating. The gap between rich and poor, so visible on the streets of London, was becoming harder to ignore. The 20th century would bring revolution, social upheaval, dramatic change. But in the Victorian twilight, the old order still held. The funeral trains kept running. The mourning warehouses kept selling black crepe. The horses kept dying in the streets. And life, in all its messy, contradictory, beautiful and terrible complexity, continued. This was Victorian London, a city of contrasts, a city of change. A city wrestling with modernity while clinging to tradition. Let's bring this back to the human level, because behind all these statistics, all these systems, all these social rituals, were individual people living individual lives, each with their own stories, their own griefs, their own daily struggles. Consider Sarah, a fictional but representative figure. She's a housemaid in a wealthy home in Belgravia, 23 years old, originally from a village in Somerset. She came to London 5 years ago, seeking work, sending money home to help her family. She wakes at 5 every morning, lights the fires, prepares breakfast, cleans, serves, works until 9 or 10 at night. Her feet ache constantly. Her hands are rough from lye soap and scrubbing. 1 day a week, Sunday afternoon, she has a few hours off. She takes the omnibus to Highgate Cemetery, not because she has family buried there, but because it's beautiful, peaceful, a refuge from her exhausting routine. She walks the paths, reads the inscriptions, thinks about her own mortality, about the life she's living, about whether this is all there is. Or consider Thomas, a railway porter at King's Cross, 45 years old, married with 6 children. He's worked the railways for 20 years, loading luggage, helping passengers, shouting arrivals and departures. His lungs are damaged from years of breathing smoke in the tunnels. He coughs constantly. But he can't afford to stop working. His family depends on his wages. When his youngest child, little Emma, died of scarlet fever last year, Thomas and his wife scraped together everything they could for a proper funeral. They bought mourning clothes, hired a modest hearse, purchased a plot in a public cemetery. It cost nearly 3 months' wages. They're still paying it off. But it mattered. Emma deserved dignity in death, deserved to be remembered properly. Thomas's wife, Mary, wore black for a full year. Even now, 18 months later, she wears gray. Half mourning, she keeps Emma's photograph on the mantelpiece, a lock of the girl's hair in a locket. Every night, she prays at the spot where Emma died. The loss hasn't diminished. It's simply become part of her, part of who she is now. A mother who's lost a child. That identity will never change. These stories, multiplied thousands of times, tens of thousands, millions. That was Victorian London. Not just systems and statistics, but people, living, working, grieving, hoping, enduring. The transportation system served them all, connected them all. The omnibus that carried the wealthy theater-goer also carried the exhausted housemaid. The underground train that transported the businessman also transported the factory worker. The hearse that carried the aristocrat's body also, in its way, inspired the design of hearses for everyone else. Death and transportation, the great equalizers, touching all classes, all lives. As the century drew to a close, as the Victorian era entered its final decade, the pace of change accelerated. Electric lighting was replacing gas lamps. Telephones were being installed. Motion pictures were invented. The automobile was being developed. The world was transforming faster than ever before. And yet, on the streets of London, horses still dominated. Omnibuses still rattled over cobblestones. The underground still ran steam trains through most of its tunnels. Mourning culture still dictated social behavior. The old and the new coexisted, often uncomfortably, always dynamically. Queen Victoria, in her palace, continued her mourning. But she also reigned over the largest empire in history. She embodied the contradiction, personal grief and public power, ancient ritual and modern empire. She was Victorian London personified, looking backward and forward simultaneously. The cemeteries kept filling. Highgate, Kensal Green, Brompton, Nunhead, Tower Hamlets, Abney Park, West Norwood, the Magnificent Seven, as they came to be known. These great Victorian cemeteries that ringed London, testaments to how seriously the Victorians took death, how much they invested in memory, how determined they were to honor their dead, even as they built a modern world. And underneath it all, literally, the underground kept expanding, deep below the cemeteries, below the streets, below the layers of history. New tunnels were being dug. New stations opened. The future was being built beneath the past. Soon, the electric trains would replace the steam. Soon, the deep-level tubes would revolutionize urban transport. Soon, London would truly become a modern city. But not yet. Not quite yet. In the 1890s, in the final years of Victoria's reign, London existed in that strange twilight between ages. The Victorian world was ending. The modern world was beginning. And for a moment, a brief historical moment, they overlapped. The horses sensed nothing of this. They simply worked, day after day, until they could work no more. Then they were replaced. The system continued. The omnibuses kept running. The passengers kept boarding. London kept moving. And when death came, as it always did, the rituals were observed, the mourning dress was worn, the funerals were held, the dead were buried, memory was honored, grief was performed, life continued, shaped by loss, but continuing nonetheless. This was Victorian London, a city of movement and memory, of progress and tradition, of life and death intertwined, where transportation connected the living and elaborate rituals honored the dead, where horses thundered through streets that would soon belong to motor cars, where steam gave way to electricity, where the 19th century prepared to become the 20th. It was a world that would soon vanish. The horses, the omnibuses, the steam trains, the elaborate mourning, all of it would fade into history, replaced by new technologies, new customs, new ways of living and dying. But for those who lived through it, for those who rode those buses and mourned their dead and navigated those chaotic streets, it was simply life, the only life they knew. And perhaps that's the most important thing to understand. To them, it wasn't history. It wasn't quaint or old-fashioned or strange. It was normal. It was modern. It was their present, not our past. They couldn't see the future we know about, couldn't imagine a world without horses in the streets, without strict mourning rules, without the constant presence of death. They lived in their moment, just as we live in ours, making the best of it, adapting to changes, honoring traditions, working hard, loving their families, mourning their losses, trying in whatever ways they could to create meaning and dignity in an often difficult and painful world. Victorian London, where transportation worked through horses, omnibuses, and trains, where mourning culture expressed profound grief through elaborate ritual, where past and future collided in the streets, where millions of individual lives played out against the backdrop of history. It's gone now. That world, those people, those horses and omnibuses and steam trains, the cemeteries remain, quiet now, overgrown in places, tourist attractions in others. The underground still runs, though completely transformed. The streets are still there, though now filled with cars and buses and bicycles instead of horses. But the stories remain, the human stories, of ordinary people living extraordinary times, of a city transforming itself, of a culture grappling with mortality, of a transportation system that connected millions, of mourning rituals that honored the dead, of progress and tradition in constant tension. This was how transportation worked in Victorian London. This was the strange culture of mourning. Complex, contradictory, fascinating, human. And with that, we've reached the end of our journey through Victorian London. Thank you for traveling with us through these smoky streets, these crowded omnibuses, these steam-filled tunnels, these elaborate funeral processions. Thank you for exploring this vanished world with us. If you enjoyed this journey, if these stories resonated with you, please consider sharing this with others who might appreciate it. History is meant to be shared. Stories are meant to be told. And the more we understand the past, the better we understand ourselves. Good night, wherever you are in the world. May your own journeys, whether by bus or train or car or foot, be safe and meaningful. And may you honor your own loved ones in whatever ways feel right to you, remembering that every culture, every era, finds its own ways to navigate the mysteries of life and death. Good night from Victorian London, a city that once was, a world that shaped our own, a story worth remembering.